Hey, good afternoon, Dr. Sanders and colleagues. It's Randall Pelton. Thanks for joining me for a few minutes on discourse analysis. And as you can see from the subtitle, my particular angle this afternoon is Meaning in Terms of Pragmatics, an Introduction to the Illocutionary Force of Scripture. I'd like to use this statement, "The dog needs to go out," as an example for us to keep in mind throughout, because in order to understand what that statement means, then there's some things that we have to know. For instance, we have to know who's saying this. If a stranger is saying this, that's one thing. If my wife Michelle is saying this, that's another. What's our relationship? Again, the relationship to a stranger is one thing, the relationship to Michelle is another. And then also, what's my relationship to the dog? If it's the stranger's dog, that's one thing. If it's our dog, that's another. And so what we're dealing with is the need to define meaning with respect to pragmatics. So I've given you a couple of definitions here. The first one comes from Yule's short book, Pragmatics, one of the Oxford series. Pragmatics is the study of how more gets communicated than is said. You can see that again in the statement, "The dog needs to go out." It's very, very possible that if Michelle is saying that to me, she is communicating more than what she's saying. The second definition comes from our textbook, Green. He's citing Brown and Yule here. We are concerned with what people using language are doing and with accounting for the linguistic features in the discourse as the means employed in what they are doing. And so pragmatics certainly is a focus on what is being done by what is being said. I want us early on in these minutes to now think about the connection between meaning and intention. You saw in the definition of pragmatics that we're focusing on, highlighting on what is being done. And so when we talk about meaning, it's important for us to move towards intention. What is, for instance, the author of Scripture intending to do to the reader? Not just what does the text mean, but what is the author intending to do? What is the text intended to do to the reader? We'll see that in a few minutes when we look at Luke 15. Here's pragmatics in a particular context. In this case, I've titled it the interpretation triad, and you're familiar with, from top right moving down left, meaning, intention, and application. When you think about that statement, "the dog needs to go out," what does that statement mean? That could simply focus on the vocabulary, the grammar, the nouns and the verbs and so on. Put the whole sentence together, we know what the sentence means. A particular dog needs to go outside, something like that. The intention, however, gets us to what is that statement doing when it's being said? What is the speaker intending to do to the hearer? And then finally, application. Application dealing with how do we put the particular statement into practice. And so for our purposes this afternoon, when we're dealing with pragmatics, we're dealing with the second and third text box, intention and application. Another way to put pragmatics into its context, and this is probably the more basic context, the more familiar, is speech act theory. And you may be familiar, you're probably familiar with locutionary acts, illocutionary acts, and perlocutionary acts. Locutionary acts, top right, that deals with what is being said, an utterance that is spoken or something that is written, the words that are written, for instance. Illocutionary acts, this centers on the intention. This is what the writer or the speaker is intending to do to the reader or the listener. And then finally, the perlocutionary acts, that's the result that the writing or the speech has to do, the result that happens by the hearer or the reader. In other words, that hearer or reader actually does something as a result of what is written or said. We're used to perlocutionary acts, especially preachers. We're used to this when we talk about application, putting the scriptures into practice. Pragmatics involves all of these. I'm probably going to be centering more on the middle one, illocutionary acts. What does the writer intend to do to the reader? And this forms a middle ground to reaching application, sort of the middle between meaning and application. We have to know about the intention. Once more, by way of context, putting it into context, and this really helps you understand pragmatics as a part of discourse analysis. Discourse analysis is normally broken down into two subfields. Text linguistics, that will be Welton's, his video, his minutes will delve into text linguistics, if I remember correctly, and then I've got the other side of this, pragmatics. Another, putting pragmatics into context again, so you can try to figure out where does it fit in what you're already doing, what we're already doing. Three kinds of textual analysis. Syntax, the study of what and how something is said. Semantics is what is meant by what is being said. And then finally, pragmatics, our focus, my focus this afternoon, what is done by what is meant or said. One of the more helpful segments of pragmatics, especially with respect to Bible interpretation, is this classification of illocutionary acts by, I believe, John Searle. This is coming out of Briggs's book, Words in Action. I've given you some of a detailed chart, and you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different kinds of illocutionary acts. In other words, this represents possible intentions of a speaker or a writer in this case. So assertives, it is raining. Directives, open the door. Commissives, I will come at 6. Expressives, I thank you for coming. Declarations, Tony Blair is hereby elected. And then finally, assertive declarations, you're guilty as charged. All of these are doing something from the top down. Assertives, the speaker is committing himself or herself to something being the case. Something is true to reality. A directive we would think of as just simply a command or instruction, the speaker attempting to get the hearer to do something. The commissive commits the speaker to some future course of action. In other words, he's making a promise here. And you can see, I hope you can hear some of these in Scripture, or think about some of these in Scripture. A commissive, for instance, committing the speaker to some future course of action. Anytime God gives a prophecy, he is committing himself to some future course of action and so forth. The expressives, the expressing of a psychological state, you can certainly find that in the Psalms and so forth. I think that's very helpful. And again, we might say, all right, do these apply to Scripture? Do we find these in Scripture, these particular classifications, these types of actions, these types of intentions? And maybe we add to the list. I think it's helpful, especially as a middle ground moving towards application from meaning. Again, it's important to think about the connection between meaning and intention. So we have not arrived at meaning if we're not able to identify what does the writer intend to do with what is being written. So we want to know what a text means. What is the idea? Yes, but we also want to move toward the intention. What is the action that the writer wants to occur on the part of the reader? That's the illocutionary force of a particular text. And that's really our bullseye. That's what we want to aim at. All right, again, just putting it into the context of interpretation, pragmatics, you'll see, are in the second and third text box. We move from meaning, the dog needs to go out. What does that mean? Well, we want to include the illocutionary act. What is the intention of the person saying that? What did they intend to do to the hearer? And then finally, the application, the perlocutionary act is when the person hears, if I hear Michelle say the dog needs to go out, then what is my response? What is my reaction? And so pragmatics deals with intention and application. All right, let's spend a few minutes looking at Luke 15. So what I'm saying is that pragmatics is one of two subfields in the discipline of discourse analysis. So if we're going to do discourse analysis on Luke 15, that includes the realm of pragmatics. And that means asking the question, what does Luke intend to do to the reader by creating the opening narrative of Jesus eating with sinners and the grumbling of the religious leaders, and then Luke moving into the recording of the parables. Three parables really forming one parable. You'll notice that the titles at the bottom of the slide, they reflect the ESV titles found in Luke 15. So at the start of Luke 15, the title is given the parable of the lost sheep. A little bit later down the paragraph, you'll find the parable of the lost coin as a heading, and then finally the parable of the prodigal son as a heading. And I'm going to argue, certainly in this presentation, I'm arguing that whoever created those titles was not thinking about meaning with respect to pragmatics. What is Luke 15 intending to do to the reader? You'll notice the two pictures in the slide. So Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal. After the parable of the lost sheep, parable of the lost coin, we get to the parable of, normally known as the prodigal son. I'm asking us in this slide, of course, to rename it on the basis of some elementary understanding of pragmatics. It needs to be the parable of something else. It's not to be focused, this parable does not focus attention on the younger brother there on the left who returns, the prodigal who returns. That's not the focus of the parable. I think you know that. On the right there, you'll see the older brother. He's the only one that's outside the house. He's not joining the party, the celebration. Celebration, of course, focused on the return of the prodigal. And so what you have with Luke 15 is Luke intending to do something to the reader. And that something, I think, is he is urging us not to be like that older brother who is representing, of course, the religious leaders in the parable. So you can see when a preacher at the end of the sermon says it's time for all prodigals to come home, that preacher also is not paying attention to pragmatics. The parable is designed to address another kind of parishioner. That's all we have time for at this point. I want to close with just some possible resources. And so you have the writings of Abraham Kuruvula, I think is a great place to start. His dissertation, Text to Praxis, and then also his JETS, 2017 JETS articles. What is the author doing with what he is saying? Pragmatics and Preaching and Appeal. You can also find his writings in a theological commentary on Judges for preachers, a theological commentary for preachers on the book of Judges and also in the book of Mark. And I think he's written some other ones that actually show his approach, which is heavy on pragmatics. I think he does a good job starting us down the road of applying pragmatics to biblical interpretation. Hey, thanks for spending time with me. Lord willing, I'll see you very soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.